And one of my favorite founding fathers of the United States was Benjamin Franklin. Everybody knows quotes from him. And one of his quotes was, "There never was a good war or a bad peace." But in that case, I got to kind of disagree with him in a sense, because the adversaries that we had during World War II, you couldn't make a good peace with them. They were atrocious, really terrible people. So that's, I consider that maybe we didn't have a good war, but we had a right war at that time. I was still in high school. I had a half year to go when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So, and I had asked my parents if I could enlist, and they said, "No, you're going to finish high school." So anyway, and they said, and then the president, President Roosevelt will send you a message when he wants you to come. Anyway, so I finished high school, and then somebody talked me into taking a job for about 6 years, but I eventually got my letter from the president, and I reported in. When I went into the service, why they asked me, if I wanted to go into any certain service or whatnot. I said, "I'd like to go into the Marines." Strange. And but they said, "Well, our quota today is filled, so you're going to go in the Army instead." And I went to basic training. Well, in basic training, they were looking for aviation cadets, and I signed up for that. Anyway, so after finished the basic training, they sent us to a college course where we learned a few things. Since they hadn't gone to college yet, they kind of brought you up to date on some college courses and whatnot before sending us on to what was called classification. I was originally classified to go to pilot training, but they had 1,500 people waiting to go to pilot training, and they didn't have anybody signed up to go to Navigator schools. So what they told us, they took 400 of us that had the highest scores on our tests, and they sent us to navigation school. So I don't know if they told us that's where, to salve our feelings or what. But anyway, it helped out a little bit, and it makes a good story too. Anyway, so navigation school was about 16 weeks long, and we spent most of the time doing celestial navigation, which is looking at the stars and plotting positions and things like that. And then after we finished navigation school, they made us officers and gentlemen. Of course, I always figured I was a gentleman before anyway, so didn't really add anything like statue. So then they sent us to a base where I first saw a B-17, and I always thought at the time a B-17 was a pretty big airplane. And I'll pass around a little picture here. And one of the things I like about this picture is I always say, see if you can find the B-17 on here. So that's kind of one of the things that kind of compares the size of the B-17 nowadays with what the airplane looked like, what other airplanes look like nowadays. So I met the crew that we were going to fly with at that time too, and while we were first introduced to the B-17, I found out that not only a Navigator is also responsible for 2 machine guns up in the front end of the B-17, and nobody ever told me about this in navigation school. So I never really learned too much about machine guns and whatnot. All the other gunners, of course, have gone through gunner school, and they know how to lead the aircraft and things like that if you're going to shoot at them and whatnot. So we got to shoot the machine guns a couple times at ground targets while we were in training there. I was sent overseas. A lot of the guys flew overseas in the B-17s, but we went over on the luxury liner, the Queen Elizabeth. Of course, the Queen Elizabeth usually carried about 3,000 passengers. We had, I think, 16,000 on board. They were sleeping 3 deep in the swimming pool down there, I know. And the worst thing about going over there, we had one rough day, and it doesn't make much difference. There's always going to be at least a tenth of the guys that are going to throw up at that time too. So it it always makes the trip a lot worse that way too. I got overseas, and somebody asked me, I was assigned to an outfit called the 100 Bomb Group. And they said, what outfit you going to? And I said, the 100. And they said, oh, the Bloody 100. And, in England sometime they'll refer to something as a bloody good show or something like that. I thought, well, that means it's a nice outfit, great outfit. Well, it turned out bloody meant bloody is what it did, because there was several cases where squadron of 12 airplanes would go out, 1 would come back, something like, or 12 would go out and only 4 would come back. It happened about 6 or 8 times like that. It ended up the group in the total, as far as that goes, didn't have more losses than other groups. It's just that they just came in big numbers. So I got into overseas about the first week in December, and of course they had the pilots had to learn the English system for there. They had learned English had a different aerial rules and whatnot than they do in the United States. So the pilots had to do some training. They had to do training in formation flying and whatnot that they hadn't got quite as much in the States yet. And then I had to do some training. The British had a different type of navigation system that was radio beacons that would read the returns on a scope and whatnot that would figure our position on. So that was a new thing I had to learn for there also. We didn't get out on our first mission until the 5th of January, 1944, and we were flying with a new crew, and we were flying a new airplane. We got over the target, and we ran out of oxygen. I don't know if it's because we were all pretty excited about our first flight, and we were breathing heavy, or if they just were short on oxygen at the time. But anyway, we had a few pass-around bottles that we shared with one another until we got out of Germany and down to lower altitude over France. And then, of course, we were out of the formation and flying by ourselves. Normally, being a navigator, and if you're not the lead navigator, you just follow along what the other planes are doing. So this was an opportunity for me to do some navigating since I was no longer following along. So we got, the pilot thought, well, as long as we're out of the formation, he says, well, let's go to Paris. So, so we headed towards Paris, and then we got to be about 200 miles from Paris, and he says, I haven't got enough gas, I need an extra. And it was completely undercast below us. Couldn't see the ground any place and whatnot. And it turned out my one compass had gone off, and it had frozen in one position. And of course I was plotting the course according to the compass. And then I told him, I said, well, take a heading for such and such for emergency, well, a buncher, which is the signal that for instrument ground landing. And I told him what the heading was for that. Well, when he turned and my compass couldn't turn, I finally figured out that I'd been plotting the wrong direction all the time, and I had to kind of go backwards and refigure the position. Then for one time, God was with us, I think. We arrived at the point where this buncher was supposed to be, and here was a hole in the cloud, and right below us was an airport. There was a fighter group that was down there. Of course, they had the steel mats and whatnot to land, but anyway, we landed there. The weather was so bad for the next 5 days, you couldn't even see across the runway, less up and down the runway. So we sat there for 5 days. Eventually got back to our own base, and of course, by that time, they were just ready to send missing in action letters back home. And of course, they canceled that. Being an officer, they hadn't picked up my personal gear yet, but they picked up the personal gear of the enlisted men in the barracks. And so they had to go and reclaim all their stuff back again. So and what they could find from it. Because every once in a while, people would have, figure, well, he's not coming back, he doesn't need it anymore. I remember that's how I ended up with an extra pistol one time, when the crew didn't come back. Then our next few missions, we'd do what was everybody started talking about, milk runs. So, like our first mission was at Frankfurt, and we had 8,000-pound bombs, or 500-pound bombs, and then incendiary bombs also. But then the next one was what we'd call a milk run. We didn't even get any flak. And the missions for the next 4 or 5 days were primarily what you'd call milk runs. You'd get a little bit of flak. Nobody got shot down in the outfit or anything. But then well, it turned out to be the 5th mission, or the 4th mission, which was my birthday. I just turned 21 at the time. I woke up in the morning with 104 fever. So into the hospital I went, and the rest of the crew went off on a mission. So, and that was an easy one for them also. We got to the 5th mission before we actually got any damage. One engine got shot out, and one of the waist gunners in back got a piece of flak in his leg. So the 6th mission was the worst mission. That was the scariest one of them all. There was we were going to Berlin, and the flak was really strong there. 2 airplanes right in front of us and a little ahead of us. They just blew up right in front of us, which really caught me right then. We were in the bloody 100 as far as that goes. We were looking right straight at these airplanes, and they explode in the air. And then a 3rd aircraft is off to the side, and the guys are bailing out of it. So we lost 4 aircraft on that mission right in our squadron. So then missions after that were relatively easy in a sense, until one of the things that was about flying and whatnot was the disappointment a lot of times when you knew that somebody made a real bad mistake. You knew you missed the target, you knew something like that. I remember one of the missions we had was at low. Most of the time we always flew at over 20,000 feet, from 20 to 24,000 feet. We had one mission that was flown at 10,000 feet. The only time we didn't use our oxygen mask and whatnot. Although you're right on the border of needing oxygen at 10,000 and whatnot. And I kind of think maybe that was what the problem was that day. Because we dropped the bombs, and it was one of the few times that I could watch the bombs and watch them fall away and watch them hit the ground and see what they were doing. And I could see the bombs landing right in it. Looked like an orchard. Trees were placed like that. And I thought, well, there was 2 reasons that happened. The bombardier didn't reset his bomb gear for low altitude, or like the rest of us, he was short on oxygen maybe. Then the mission right after that was another lucky one. Another squadron came in onto the dropping point exactly the same time we did, coming right alongside of one another. The co-pilot happened to look out the window and saw this one wing kind of overlapping ours. He punched the plane in a dive, and of course you're not strapped in anything, so up in the ceiling I went. And I saw the toggler, the guy that dropped the bombs. He's up front. He goes up to the ceiling also when the plane drops off on it. And of course I'm kind of happy because I had just looked out the window and I saw these planes there. I thought, well, we avoided that. But he told me afterwards, as he was coming, as we were going down, the bombs from the other group were with us. So we're kind of going down together. The bombs in our bombs had dropped off at the same time, but we had two 2,000-pound bombs and two 1,000 bombs on board that time. Two of them dropped away, but when they dropped away, they had come forward in the bomb bay and slammed up against the wall up there. Punched a couple holes in the front of the wall before they dropped away. The other two didn't come off the hangar, so they were hung up in there. And so anyway, the Toggleair went back there and manually got them released it. So this was another case where I had to find my way home by myself because we were out of formation then again. They had briefed us early that the islands off the Dutch coast had been freed and whatnot. The Germans were no longer on those islands off the Dutch coast. So we went down and we're doing a little sightseeing across Holland and went across those islands. And then the Germans started shooting at us down there. But we were low enough and going fast enough that, and I guess they didn't get enough time to really get out and shoot at us and whatnot. When the weather was bad, we had on board, or we didn't have it on board, there was at least one or two planes that had kind of primitive radar, with primitive in that case and whatnot, and the guy that operated was usually called a Mickey operator. And on one of our missions, we were bombing strictly by what the radar was showing us. The clouds were too thick to see the ground anymore. He got wounded, and I think the fact that he got wounded, that was one of the things that was another case where we missed the target by miles and whatnot. Kind of figured that's one of the things that we had when we went to another mission back to Berlin. And that was the first time we saw the jets, the German jets, and they hit our group that time and took 4 out, and just one passing through our group and whatnot, shot down 4 of them. So, and we saw jets. Then a couple days later, we also saw the jets, but at that time they only took 1 out of our group. And I mentioned earlier that I had 2 machine guns that up front. One time the Germans they had been briefed to ram us. They rammed one plane in the squadron, they knocked the rudder off and the stabilizer, but the guy kept the plane in the air. But a piece of that went back and hit one other plane behind that and damaged that plane behind it. Well, a German Messerschmitt came right up alongside of us, and I think he was trying to poke his wing into our wing, but he missed, but he stalled out right alongside of us. Funny thing was, I had my machine gun aimed right directly at him. I pulled the trigger, it was unsafe. And why it was unsafe? Because we had a kind of a procedure when we crossed the channel. Of course, when you took off, you didn't have anything in the guns. You put your first shot in the gun, and then you take a couple practice shots, and then you leave the gun like that. So I must have just automatically took the practice shots and clicked it back on safe, and of course then, well, you got an opportunity. But that was, the interesting thing about this was, normally when you're flying in an airplane, you see other airplanes. You never see a person. And this is the difference between being a soldier on the ground and a pilot in the airplane and whatnot. Because I know, I had talked to a fighter pilot after the war, and he says, the first time he shot down an enemy plane, he saw this guy bail out, and he said, "Oh my God, there was a guy in there." So you don't realize that thing. And this was the first time. This one came up so close, I could see the pilot sitting in there, and it looked like the pilot was looking right at me, and I was looking at him, And so it was really the first time that kind of brought that to up, what the difference is between a guy in an airplane that you're doing damage, but you don't see who you're doing damage to, And whereas the guy on the ground, he knows what he's shooting at. So it was quite a thing that came to mind at that time. So but the interesting there was that the plane that got rammed, it was on the 17th of April, and 10 days later we took that plane up. They fixed that plane up, put a new rudder on it, put a new stabilizer on it. The guy that was flying it when it got rammed, I talked to him and he said, oh yeah, he said, but it doesn't fly the same as it used to, he said. So apparently the guys that fixed it at the base didn't do quite as good a job on it. Towards the, we had one mission where we dropped napalm. I don't know of any other mission over in Europe where they used napalm. But the Germans had held out on the French coast, over on the western French coast. They had a place there, and the French were complaining about the Germans were stealing their cattle and whatnot, I suppose, making raids on the farmers and things like that. So we had to go in there and drop bombs on them to get them to surrender. Well, after we dropped the napalm on them, well, they did, a couple days later, they did surrender and whatnot. So the interesting thing about that was the one flight that we couldn't smoke on board. Those, as soon as you got on the airplane, you could smell jellied gas, and they were in P-51 drop tanks is what they were. And when you get up to altitude, apparently they'd overfilled them. So when you got up to altitude, they expanded and they started leaking. And so there'd be some of the jelly gas be laying in the bomb bay before the doors would swing open. Well, the worst thing of all happened then was when we went to open the bomb bay doors, the bombs fell out without the toggler tripping them off. Well, in fact, since this was a small enclave of Germans there, we were actually over French territory when we opened our bomb doors. So these bombs then dropped on friendly territory is what it was, but it was a farmer field and whatnot, so nobody got hurt from it, except the toggler got busted for it. He went down to a private real quick. Surprising thing, he was flying with us the next day as a private anyway. So anyway, when the war ended, well, not quite when the war ended, but we had our last mission on the 20th of April, and then we got word that the people in Holland were starving. In fact, during that winter, I don't know if you're familiar with a military operation called Market Garden. They had made a movie about it. Market Garden was not a success, and the people in Holland had gone on a rail strike to support Market Garden. Of course, when Market Garden was not a success, and then the Holland was still occupied by the Germans put a lot of restrictions on the people in Holland. In fact, one of the things they did, they took all the rail equipment out of the country. Of course, they needed it to replace it back in their own country, too, at the same time. But it ended up about 20,000 Dutch people starved that winter from up until May and whatnot. And so then we signed, the military commander in Holland signed a agreement not to shoot at us if we came in and dropped food. So we came in at low altitude and dropped the sea rations. And of course the British were coming in, they were dropping food in burlap bags and whatnot. One of the best things about that, of course, is just a month ago, I was out in Savage, where my daughter has a apartment out there. And when she and I got on the apartment, another guy got on the apartment, and I was wearing a shirt that said 8th Air Force on it. And he says, oh, he says, your planes were flying over my country when I was a kid. And I said, what country was that? And I said, that was Holland. And he says, oh, he says, I remember that because we had white bread after that. And I thought, that was pretty neat. I thought, here's something that after all these years, something kind of comes back to what you had done earlier. One nice thing about being in England, of course, is that you understand the conversation there. And of course, not only that, the people were friendly too. I know I have some friends that were flying out of Italy, and they said that the Italians, of course, that was an occupied country at that time. The Italians had been enemies, and some of them still were enemies when they got down there. And one of the guys says there was apparently a lot of espionage going on, because one guy told me that when they went on a flight, they had the commander of one of the squadron was the flight leader, and he had been a swimmer in the 1936 Olympics, and he had met some Germans over there, and the Germans knew this guy was a commander there, because they met one time on the radio. They mentioned his name, and they mentioned the little pink-cheeked Navigator from Minnesota. Now that was the other friend that was flying out. So this came over the radio. So there was apparently a lot of espionage going on down in England. But nice thing about, or in Italy, nice thing about in England was that, like I said, when you one of the things another thing that just came up recently was that the woman singer that was the most popular one in England back when we were over there was Vera Lynn, and her birthday just came up. 100th birthday came up in January. I mentioned this to my granddaughter. My granddaughter went out and she got me a CD of Vera Lynn singing, and it brought back to mind a couple of songs that were very popular with us at the time. One of them was the White Cliffs of Dover. Yeah, because once in a while, depending on where we came back from, we'd pass by the White Cliffs of Dover. So another one. And another one was that We'll Meet Again, which was a great song. All the British people would, when the guy would say time's up in the pub, well, everybody would sing, "We'll meet again." From nowhere. Okay, one of the things that I found out, when doing looking up some of the information that I wanted right for today, I found out that the Americans in England, they were great souvenir collectors. There was one of the most things they collected was women. Yeah, there was. It turned out there was 70,000 guys married English women. American guys did, and something like 40,000 Canadian guys married English women also. So, like I say, they brought home their souvenirs. Of course, like all marriages, they weren't all successful either. Okay. All right. I guess I got this talking about songs. This and of course, songs were always something that kind of made you sentimental when you were over there too. There's always a lot of conversation about amount of flak. Flak, of course, is the anti-aircraft that the Germans shoot at you and whatnot. And I was never really concerned about, when in an aircraft, you've got the aircraft noise, you've got headsets on, you don't hear the explosions or anything. You can see the puff of smoke appearing out here and whatnot. And as long as you don't see a red flash, it's far enough away that it's not going to be any damage. If you see a red flash, they're going to get some damage. We had lost engine on a couple different times where they exploded that close. And of course, these little pieces, they're only about an inch by an inch or something like that, because the shells are segregated or scored so that they'll break up in pieces like that. But this is kind of a picture here of kind of what it looks like, some of the flak going off. Okay, well, thank you. Is there any questions, or?
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.